Not only is there a Marine Corps Aviation Squadron with my favorite playing card as an insignia, but it has such a storied and rich history that if I had the option to both become a Marine aviator and outright pick the squadron I got to go into, this is the one I would choose. Today, we're going to deep dive into the oldest Marine Corps Aviation Squadron, Marine Attack Squadron, or VMA-231, aka the Ace of Spades. The Ace of Spades is the first card in any brand new deck, and in the same way, this squadron is the first permanent Marine Aviation Squadron in US history. It is also the most ornate and decorative card, and VMA-231 holds a number of awards and achievements due to its long service life and the forward-thinking madmen who shaped it. But most importantly, the spade symbol is often lengthened slightly to represent the spear point, because that is the symbol of those who lead the way, just as the Ace of Spades would lead the way in developing a new technique that would become the hallmark of US naval warfare in the Second World War. VMA-231's origins lie, ironically enough, in the war to end all wars. When the US entered World War I on April 6, 1917, there was a massive expansion of its armed forces, and with the development of warplanes in Europe, the US Navy and Marines also began looking into using this technology to both patrol for submarines and support infantry via reconnaissance and artillery spotting. As a result, the Marines would form two aviation units in October of 1917, the 1st Marine Aeronautic Company, which focused on using seaplanes for anti-submarine patrols, and the 1st Aviation Squadron, which would focus on the land-based side of things. 1st Aviation Squadron would then be split up into 4 smaller squadrons, A, B, C, and D. All 4 of these squadrons would go through the usual preparatory regimes of recruiting pilots, training them up, and then being deployed to combat in northern France. At least all of them except Squadron D. Squadron D would stay behind in the US and continue training, as well as establish a base of operations, because it's kinda hard to train new pilots if you don't have a place to train them, and if all the people who can train you are busy with their own things. So on April 1st, 1918, they would take possession of an old Curtiss flying school near the Everglades in Florida, and rename it the Marine Flying Field. This would become the home of what was then renamed the 1st Marine Aviation Force, or FMAF, and they would begin training large groups of pilots all the way until the end of the war. After World War I ended, much like what pretty much every country typically assumes after a war, the US felt there was no longer a major need for a large force, so Marine Corps Aviation began demobilizing and downsizing their air forces. As a result of this, by February 8th of 1919, FMAF was disbanded at Miami, but the force's remnants were assembled into a much smaller force and the 1st permanent Marine Aviation Squadron, known as 1st Division Squadron D, and flying JN-4D Jenny training aircraft. 3 years later, in 1921, Squadron D would redesignate as the 1st Air Squadron, and for the first time, they would adopt their legendary symbol, the Ace of Spades. They would design it as a classic Ace of Spades playing card, except instead of the inverted A in the lower corner, they would make it an S, making the A stand for Air and the S stand for Squadron. However, while this logo would stay the same for the rest of the squadron's time on Earth, this is the point where they would start acting like spies with all the different name changes they would get in the early years. Because 3 days before America's birthday, on July 1st of 1922, 1st Air Squadron would be redesignated again, this time to Marine Observation Squadron 1, which was also finally given a proper shorthand designation of VO-1M. And it's about time. I mean, the Marines are here to take names and chew bubblegum, not memorize words on a page.
I didn't come here to read, I came here to eat.
However, this redesignation was also due to a change in role from training to recon, so they would convert away from the Jennies and receive new O2B-1s, a slightly modified copy of the British de Havilland DH-4 Liberty Scout biplanes license built by Boeing. You know, back in the days when they didn't have a subterranean reputation. However, the winds of legend would really start shifting in the Ace of Spades' direction over the next several years, especially following the assignment of a new commanding officer in 1924, Major Ross E. Rowell. Rowell was a good commanding officer, the kind who leads from the front and sets the tone with his actions instead of his words. But he was also something of visionary because he would bring to the squadron a bigger purpose than just being a bunch of flyboys taking pictures up in the sky.
Have I got plans for you?
See, back in May of the year before, Rowell would take an advanced instruction course from the US Army, and in that course, the Army would demonstrate a new aerial tactic they learned from the British: dive bombing. Now, dive bombing of the time was what most tacticians and historians today would refer to as glide bombing instead, and the difference lies specifically in the dive angle. What they referred to as dive bombing at the time was entering a 45-degree dive with the nose pointed at the target, then releasing the bomb from about 250 feet before pulling out and regaining altitude. The dive bombing pattern that most people think of today are the anti-ship routines of World War II, where planes bent it over into a much steeper 70+ degree dive with the dive brakes deployed before releasing their bombs and turning their pilots into human pancakes with crushing 7 to 9G pullouts. So you could always tell who a dive bomber was in bed because their pullout game was always on point. But the reason early dive bombing practices shied away from those steep angles was because the planes they were using were just too fragile. Early planes from the 1920s and 30s weren't made from composite materials or even all metal constructions back then. They were mostly built out of fabric and wood. If those planes were to start hitting high diving speeds, say over 400 miles an hour, they are going to turn a battle into a party because the only thing falling from the sky is going to be confetti.
This thing's just full of surprises.
Surprise!
But early biplanes could do well enough with those 45-degree dives because the trusses, wires, struts, and all that extra shit between the wings produced enough drag that early aircraft wouldn't exceed that 400-mile-per-hour barrier, and they wouldn't need dedicated modifications like specialized flaps or dive brakes. Now, the Army would eventually stop practicing this dive bombing technique due to safety concerns, but Raoul is a Marine. Marines are aggressive against the enemy, and when in doubt, they are absolutely willing to forego a little extra safety for a lot of extra damage. And it's a little easier to do a lot of extra damage when you can actually put the bombs exactly where you want them, and the improved drop accuracy that dive bombing offered over horizontal level flight bombing would absolutely give them that. So much so that Raoul was quoted as saying, "I immediately visualized the certain naval employment of such tactics, where accuracy against small moving targets is paramount. Also, it seemed to me that it would be an excellent form of tactics for use in guerrilla warfare." So when he took command of VO-1M in 1924, he would immediately get to work with obtaining Army-style bomb racks and retrofitting them to the wings of the unit's O-2B-1s. Once that was done, he would begin relentlessly mastering the technique himself, and once he figured that out, he would start drilling the skill set into the rest of the squadron's pilots, until everyone could knock down a bombing target like a well-oiled machine. VO-1M would also demonstrate these skills at air shows up and down both US coasts as part of their training, and Raoul himself would get so good at it that during the gunnery year of 1924 to 1925, he would get the highest bombing score out of the entire Marine Corps. And his unit management was done so well on top of that the squadron's operations at their home base of Naval Air Station San Diego would receive praise from the Commandant of the Marine Corps for how efficiently things got done. And that efficiency and skill level was necessary because Raoul wasn't just thinking of helping out the Navy sometime down the road. The Marines also needed that skill set right now. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, America was involved in a series of campaigns in the Caribbean and Central America known as the Banana Wars. There's a lot of conversation on whether or not these conflicts were done out of US interests in stability and strategic ideas, or if they were just imperialistic and done out of corporate interests via corrupt practices. It's a complete rabbit hole all on its own, and it's also not the subject of this video, but whether you like it or not, it happened. And within those conflicts, the Marines and the Ace of Spades would become famous for applying their new dive bombing skills after getting involved in Nicaragua. How did they do that? Well, the really short and oversimplified version is that in the early 1900s, the Howard Taft administration's Secretary of State Philander Knox was becoming less and less agreeable with the policies of the Nicaraguan President Jose Zelaya, who had come to power in 1983 by way of a military coup.
I'm the captain now.
In 1909, another revolt broke out, this time against Zelaya, led by a man named Juan Estrada, and in that revolt, 2 US citizens who had been serving in the rebel army were captured and executed. I don't know if they had been conscripted and forced to fight somehow, or if this was voluntary on their part, but either way, it gave Knox the opportunity to drag US forces into the picture and overthrow Zelaya. Following the capture of the capital city of Managua, the US would agree to recognize Estrada's new government, in exchange for persecution of the ones who killed the US citizens, establishing a commission to handle property damage claims, and hosting a new election within the next 6 months. However, Estrada's grip on the new government was basically made out of sand, and he had a lot of enemies with way more influence, which which makes sense. Zelaya had been in power for more than 15 years, and Estrada had been there for all of 5 seconds. No way he's gonna have a full handle on it. So to help improve the balance of power in Estrada's, and by extension America's favor, Knox sent a special agent, Thomas Dawson, to assess the political scene and provide guidance. Dawson, doing his first job of figuring out what the hell's going on down there, immediately realized that if Estrada held an election as the US demanded, not only would he would lose to the followers of the guy he'd just overthrown. 15 years versus 5 seconds makes a lot of difference in political opinions, who'da thunk it. So instead of holding the election as they normally would, Dawson advised Estrada to set up a constituent assembly, basically an electoral college, you know, rigging the vote.
You are so disappointing on so many levels.
I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying I like it, I'm just saying it happened, and just like most selfishly concocted schemes, frankly, it didn't even work. Over the next few years, Estrada would be ousted by his political rivals and replaced with his own vice president. All the while, the Nicaraguan government conceded to the US's demands they had made to recognize the new government in the first place, which was no longer even the one they had tried to make. For some reason, somewhere along the way, the US would decide that this was another perfect opportunity to try their hand at nation building, basically reshaping a country using America's template. As a result, the US added some new requirements, those being the abolition of monopolies and the writing of a new constitution. And because part of the reason Nicaragua was even this unstable to begin with was the inability to pay back European nations for other debts accrued, in order to start settling many of these demands and get back in the governing game, the Nicaraguan government would have to take out a loan to rebuild. This loan would be put together via the Knox-Castrillo Treaty signed on June 6, 1911, and the bonds used to process the transaction would be handled by Nicaraguan customs but overseen by an American-approved collector general elected by a U.S. banking consortium.
Because we've got something they'll never have. Discretionary spending.
This loan treaty was immediately accepted by Nicaragua, but then Congress would do what it has apparently always done and make things worse. Although in this case, I wouldn't say they did it for the wrong reasons. The Senate's Foreign Relations Committee was highly suspicious of the Taft administration because some of their members had connections to large corporations, and President Howard Taft himself had implemented measures that made things easier for big businesses. However, this pissed off more of the progressive Republicans at the time, including Taft's predecessor and teacher, Teddy Roosevelt. As a side note, in the history of American politics, this is probably one of the major turning points that created the more familiar history of typically very business-friendly Republican policies and typically much more worker-friendly Democratic policies. But at the time, these divisions were only just getting started, and so the Senate stalled the treaty's passage for almost a year. And when it finally did get to the table, the vote failed. But Nicaragua wasn't just frozen in a block of ice this entire time. National functions never rest, and this one literally needed money last year.
Help me! Help me!
So instead, they would turn to 2 privately owned U.S. banks, Messrs. Brown Brothers and J&W Seligman, for a total loan of $15 million. But because they turned to the private sector, this deal would come without a lot of the protections that the U.S. government could have given them, and as collateral for repayment, Nicaragua ended up giving up control of its national railroad company to the banks, at least until the loans were paid off. Additionally, because the banks weren't willing to pay out the full amount without the coverage of the Knox-Castrillo Treaty, they originally only paid out 10% of the agreed amount, meaning Nicaragua only got $1.5 million at first for the purpose of restructuring their banks, reforming their currency to the gold standard, and establishing that claims commission they had wanted in the first place. Oh, and by the way, the US would also attempt to secure that claims committee by limiting claims processing to being done only by a Nicaraguan American committee, which could potentially deter any European rivals from submitting claims of their own.
I'm in a tank and you're not!
However, to absolutely no one's surprise, these changes came so fast and were so wide-reaching in scope that the Nicaraguans didn't like it very much, and public opinion would very quickly turn against the US and its efforts. These tensions would turn into another revolt in July 1912 by the Minister of War, Luis Mena, who had also just won the presidential election the following year, so not entirely sure why the revolt was necessary. However, the US would back Diaz at his request for the US to cover their own interests. The US would reinforce Diaz, the revolt would fail, and Mena would leave the country. But this history of instability would result in a 100 Marine detachment being garrisoned in Nicaragua for over a decade until their withdrawal in 1925. And the very next instant, there would be a third rebellion. I mean, technically the fourth one, because there was another one between the appointment of Estrada and the Knox-Castillo Treaty, but that's neither here nor there. Diaz, who had been replaced by this point, came out of retirement to act as a compromise president between the existing ruling party and the rebels. But after a few years, there was enough threat from 3 different nationalists that the US decided it would again deploy an intervention force. In early 1927, the US would organize a force of 2,000 Marines to be dispatched to the island, and on the 18th of February, VO-1M, under Raul's command, would ship out for Nicaragua to start their first combat deployment with a roster of 8 officers, 81 enlisted men, and 6 O-2B-1 aircraft. After landing at the port of Corinto, they would travel by train to Managua, where they would set up shop on the outskirts of the city. Ace of Spades Squadron would begin cooperating with local forces like the Nicaraguan Air Forces to get their bearings, and on the 21st of May, they would be joined by a second aviation squadron, VO-4M, eventually known as the Diamondbacks, also under Major Raul's command as the Aircraft Squadron's 2nd Brigade. And they would blow up not a damn thing.
Oh, come seriously!
The Marine aviators were not allowed to engage the rebels directly because the US had only intervened to protect its own interests in the region, declaring neutral zones around US properties and businesses. The Marines were only to engage Nicaraguan forces if they entered these zones, so VO-1M was limited to flying visual and photo recon flights over the enemy for intelligence gathering. By May of 1927, the former Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, was sent in to make a peace agreement to get the rebels to lay off it, and so the Stimson Agreement, or the Tippy-Tapa Agreement, was signed. This agreement shifted sole governing enforcement back to the Nicaraguan police and their National Guard, the Guardia Nacional, and since that means the Marines won't be planning on kicking teeth in anytime soon, they would begin withdrawing back to the States. All of VO-1M, except for enough crew to field 2 planes, would withdraw that June, leaving them attached to VO-4M and still under the command of Raul. The US would drop a quick name change to both squadrons, again 3 days before America's birthday, from Marine Observation Squadron 1, or VO-1M, to Marine Observation Squadron 8, or VO-8M, just as a little extra hint of chaos before the storm really struck Nicaragua's Marine detachment.
Oh God, he's here.
Turns out the Stimson Agreement didn't actually satisfy all the rebels, and the units under the leadership of one of those 3 nationalists, Augusto Cesar Sandino, known as the Sandinistas, were still planning on fighting. And on the 16th of July 1927, 500 Sandinistas would launch an attack on the 49 Nicaraguan Guardia garrisoned at the city of Ocotal. But in this attack, they would make a critical error in judgment because the Guardia were not the only fighters stationed at the Ocotal garrison. There were also 38 US Marines. So if they thought the US was intervening before, they are about to learn the actual definition of an intervention. They would begin the attack at 1:15 in the morning, and because they're fighting both Marines and Guardia trained by those Marines, the Sandinistas would be repelled several times over the next 7 hours. At 8:10 in the morning, Sandino's forces would come to the Marines, but they weren't offering their own surrender. Rather, they would offer the Marines a truce to let them surrender, to which the Marines responded,
No.
You gotta remember, this is the Marines we're talking about. When they fight, they're gonna beat your ass or they're gonna die trying. There is no gray area. You didn't just start a fight with a branch of the US military, you started a fight with their cult. That is a guaranteed mistake, and you're about to find out how big. That said, though, the Ocotal defenders were absolutely outnumbered, and that meant they were in trouble, because in order to get reinforcements, those reinforcements would have to come from Managua. The capital city was where the majority of American forces were stationed, and it was 125 miles away from Ocotal, making it a 10 to 14 day journey for any relief force to arrive on foot, and the garrison didn't have nearly enough water, food, or ammunition to last anywhere near that long. They will not make it. But as luck would have it, the daily routine aerial reconnaissance patrol was in the air. At 10:15 in the morning, the usual pair of recon flights went overhead. A pair of VO-8M O-2B-1s flown by Lieutenant Hayden D. Boyden and Gunner Michael Wadarczyk would observe the incoming attack and take no time at all to recognize they were in the only position to help anyone. But they still needed information on where the enemy was coming, how many there were, etc., etc. And radios weren't exactly a thing yet, so the only way they were going to get info from anybody is to talk to somebody else. So Boyden scans the ground around the battlefield, and for some reason, there's like a local resident or a couple of them nearby. I don't know why they were there. Apparently Nicaraguans have seen so many rebellions at this point, this is just a fucking Tuesday to them. But he was there, and Boyden needs intel, so he's asking him questions. So Boyden lands his plane in the middle of the field, smack dab in front of the line of sight of the incoming invasion force, to grab information from this local who's just there. These bandits see the American aircraft land by itself in the middle of the field, and they're all like,
"Get that motherfucker!"
And they start bum rushing Boyden. So to cover him, Wlodarczyk just starts doing death donuts around the landing site. He's using his machine guns to strafe the bandits on the way into the pass, the rear gunner is using his trainable machine gun on the way out, and somehow by the grace of God and a lot of 303, he manages to keep the bandits off of Boyden until he can take off again.
I'm gonna kill you through the magic of friendship and this gun I found.
Boyden would take the intel he just grabbed and make a beeline back to Managua for backup, and Wlodarczyk in the meantime would continue strafing the enemy, presumably to allow the locals that had just helped them to escape for another 20 minutes before heading back himself. Upon receiving the news, Raul wouldn't even wait to ask permission before ordering all aircraft he had loaded and fueled with 600 rounds of ammo, a partial load of bombs, and a large load of gas for the long flight ahead. He then relayed the intel to the brigade commander, Brigadier General Logan Phelan, to which he said in Raul's words, "To take such immediate steps as I deemed to be most effective in succoring the besieged Marines and Guardia." The enemy doesn't know it yet, but they are about to find out the hard way that the most dangerous thing in the world is a Marine and his rifle. And these Marines have just been given a blank check to fire whatever they want from them. The gloves are off now, the can of whoop ass is open, the Sandinistas have screwed up on a level they do not even comprehend, and you better believe they are about to find out.
Oh, y'all up now.
At 12:30 in the afternoon, a flight of 5 O2B-1s led by Raul himself took off from Managua for Ocotal, but they had to detour around a thunderstorm, so they would arrive just over 2 hours later at about 2:35 in the afternoon. Raul personally led the attack, diving in first and strafing on the way down, and then dive bombing the enemy with fragmentation bombs, which would absolutely shred the exposed enemies on the ground. Then they would pull up, strafe them again with the rear gunner on the way back up, and rinse and repeat. Combat would last for 45 minutes, and truth be told, Raul knew these attacks did far more damage than they should have. In his own words, since the enemy had not been subjected to any form of bombing attack other than the dynamite charges thrown from the Laird Swallows by the Nicaraguan Air Force, they had no fear of us. They exposed themselves in such a manner that we were able to inflict damage which was out of proportion to what they would have suffered had they taken cover. The bandits would begin fleeing the battle after the second round of bombing started, and the ground commander would go on to say, quote, "The air attack was the deciding factor in our favor, for almost immediately the firing slackened and troops began to withdraw." This was the first all-American dive bombing attack in U.S. history, as well as the first combined air-ground combat action in Marine Corps history. The Marines would continue to use dive bombing throughout the rest of the Nicaraguan conflict, and Sandino would never again mass his forces in ways that would be vulnerable to those air attacks. While he and the Sandinistas would continue fighting until the Marines fully withdrew from the country, 6 months later the other two rebelling leaders would sign for peace. But this success wasn't limited to just the campaign in Nicaragua. The training in dive bombing given to the pilots of VO-8M showed the value of using close air support against small insurgent units. And this lesson would change the direction of both the Ace of Spades squadron and the way the entire US military conducted warfare for decades afterwards. The combat in Nicaragua literally wrote the textbook the Marines used for fighting counterinsurgency warfare. By the start of World War II, the US military would publish the Small Wars Manual, written with these and other lessons in mind, which would then become the primary source for the revised handbook the US used during their time in Afghanistan. And to top it off, for their actions, Lieutenant Boyden and Major Raul would become some of the first Marine aviators to ever receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. And just like that, VO-8M was back to peacetime. The year after the Nicaragua fiasco in 1928, VO-8M would convert from their old O2B-1s to new Curtiss F-8C, or later OC-2, biplanes. These were sturdier naval biplanes that were designed as multi-role aircraft, at least as multi-role as you could be in those days, but better suited to dive bombing tactics that the squadron was getting better at. And while these planes were originally nicknamed the Falcons, they would unofficially come to be known by the Marines as
The Helldivers.
And their first high-profile use of these planes was not in combat, at least not in real combat. In 1929, VO-8M would work alongside VO-10M to film the movie Flight, which became one of the first films to ever feature Marine aviators. And while the movie wasn't exactly well received for its story design, the aircraft displays were well liked by the general public, and the movie did okay for its time. However, all good things must come to an end, because in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Great Depression would be the major influencing factor on military budgets, and the Marines were no exception. The military was going through highly reduced military spending, and the Marines, being at the bottom of the Navy's budget list as usual, were reduced to survival-level expenses and a massive cost-focused restructuring of Marine Corps air power. In April of 1931, VO-8M would be given the units and aircraft of their Hollywood star sister VO-10M after its deactivation. And over the next several years, the Marines would elect to focus their efforts on training for amphibious landings in warfare, eventually spelling out the end for VO-8M on July 1st, 1933. I'm just kidding, that didn't last very long. Further reductions in the force structure would see the Marines disband 2 more squadrons, VS-14M and VS-15M, and reassign all those pilots to VO-8M, which would be pulled back out of the deck and reactivated on November 15th, 1934. And since these 2 squadrons were composed of planes and pilots that had been flying off of Carriers since 1931, the deck would now be loaded with experienced carrier-capable pilots and their planes, the Vought 03U-6 Corsair. Starting to see a pattern here with some of these names. But with the new naval experience and planes, the Ace of Spades would now shift its attention towards training for carrier ops. Over the next several years, the squadron would be bounced from carrier to carrier for training exercises, including CV-1 USS Langley, CV-4 USS Ranger, and CV-3 USS Saratoga. They would then help film another movie, Devil Dogs of the Air, in 1935, which also did okay for the time, but also still did a great job of showcasing the aircraft. Then they would get hit with another name change in 1937, again 3 days before America's birthday on July 1st, from VO-8M Marine Observation Squadron 8 to VMS-2, or Marine Scouting Squadron 2, and they would convert from the Corsairs to the land-based version of the Curtiss SOC-3 Seagull Scout float planes. They would train with these aircraft for another several years until January of 1941, when they would deploy to Marine Corps Air Station Iwa in Hawaii, 7 miles to the west of Pearl Harbor. Here they would begin taking possession of 27 of the first American all-metal monoplane carrier dive bombers, the SB-2U Vindicators, and then get another name change 6 months later on, you guessed it, on July 1st, being redesignated to Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 231, or VMSB 231. And as you might have guessed by the timeline, that peacetime didn't last very long, and by this point, the US was completely anticipating their involvement in World War II. To this end, VMSB 231 was assigned to CV-2 USS Lexington and given orders to depart from Midway Atoll. And here's the scary thing. All the US history books always mention the fact that the carriers were away from Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked, but they kind of all glaze over where they were or when they left. USS Lexington and VMSB 231 left MCAS Iwa on the 5th of December, 2 days before Japan touched America's boats. They escaped one of the most notorious surprise attacks in history by the skin of their teeth. Then Pearl Harbor happened those 2 days later, and the USS Lexington would receive word the same day, causing them to use U-turn to return to the Pacific Pokeball in Iwa by December 10th, where they would discover that the rear echelon had lost 6 of the 7 spare Vindicators left behind due to the enemy's attack. There's also a bunch of people dead, and now everybody's pissed, Marines included. And that means somebody's about to have a really bad rest of forever.
No, I'm mad. I'm really, really mad. And now it's time to pay!
On the 17th of December, VMSB 231 would once again set out from Midway. But when they got there was no boat pulling into port, because the Ace of Spades didn't take one. VMSB 231 had mounted extra fuel tanks onto each of their Vindicators and flown there. And if I were the Japanese at the time, I would be at least a little bit scared, because this wasn't just some short skip across the ocean. No, this was a 1,137-mile flight that took the squadron 9 hours and 45 minutes to complete, and not a single plane or crew member was lost due to mechanical difficulties or ditching along the way. Do you understand how angry someone has to be to power chase the sun across multiple time zones for almost 10 hours straight? This was a new world record for the longest overwater flight by a single-engine aircraft, and they did it out of spite. The Ace of Spades is so mad, they broke a world record by accident as a means to an end just so they could go beat the living daylights out of the enemy.
You probably shouldn't be. I don't know, man. You might want to be a little shitted right now.
Fast forward to the 1st of March 1942, VMS-231 is split into two units, itself and VMS-241. Then in the early days leading up to the Battle of Midway on the 4th of June, VMS-231 was transferred back stateside to Iwo. At least on paper. The majority of the squadron's people and all of their planes would stay on the island and be attached to VMS-241. Why would they split their squadron and then transfer half of it stateside? Because at this point in time, America had cracked the Japanese code and knew that they were targeting Midway. To that end, the Japanese were monitoring US communications, as evidenced by the water shortage trick that Nimitz approved of in May of 1942 that confirmed it. By moving around a squadron of dive bombers on paper only, it would convince the Japanese that the island would be even less of a threat to their carriers. The resulting illusion of a balance of air power more focused on air-to-air combat would give the Japanese even more reason to bring their carriers along, where the Japanese could focus on using their air power to beat the American air power using their better naval fighters. It was one more piece of the puzzle the US needed to lure out the carriers and ensure that they were present so they could destroy them and cripple the Japanese Navy. The aircraft and pilots of VMS-231 would participate in the Battle of Midway alongside their sister squadron in a brutal battle, but ultimately an American victory, before returning to MCAS Iwo on the 30th of June. Back at Iwo, the Ace of Spades would finally begin upgrading from the now obsolete Vindicators to 27 new SBD-5 Dauntlesses, and then they would redesignate again. The exact date isn't given, but considering the pattern and the current time window, I'm willing to bet you already know what day it was. That's right, it was probably 3 days before America's birthday, on July 1st, 1942, that VMS-231 would be renamed Marine Fighter Squadron, or VMF-231, even though they were receiving dive bombers. Could have been an anti-spy tactic, but I digress. Regardless, somewhere in July that year, they would receive new orders to deploy as the rear echelon of Marine Aviation Group 23, or MAG-23, on their newest deployment. After getting all their new planes and training all their new pilots, in the last week of August, the now VMF-231 would load up on AKV-1 USS Kitty Hawk, sail to Efedi on the island of Vanuatu, and be transferred to AVC-1 USS Long Island, after which they would fly from the Long Island to Espiritu Santo, and on August 30th, they would finally arrive to reinforce their destination, Guadalcanal. VMF-231 would join up with the rest of the Cactus Air Force on Henderson Field just in time for the daily Japanese air raids.
Into the fire!
And those raids would be an absolute train wreck for VMF-231. The squadron would go through 3 different commanding officers in the span of 5 days, starting with Major Leo Smith. He was killed on September 18th, and the next day, command would transfer to Captain Reuben Iden. Iden would then be killed the day after taking command, when he and his wingman got lost after a recon mission and were forced to crash land after running out of fuel, which Iden did not survive. Command would then pass to Captain Elmer Glidden. They were also running out of planes. In less than 5 weeks between August 30th and October 3rd, 11 of the original 12 SBDs brought in by VMF-231 were either shot down, destroyed, or irreparably foobarred by the Japanese bombing raids during the day and the fleet bombardments at night. The Ace of Spades is just getting hammered at this point. While it was a victory, Midway was also a mess and cost them a lot of guys on just the first day, and now they're getting pounded day in and day out at Guadalcanal.
Damn, my brother can't catch a break today.
And probably due to the general anger and indignation of not being able to do a whole lot, one of the Ace of Spades pilots, Second Lieutenant Glenn Lawful, would don his plot armor and become another main character for the Ace of Spades. Because right after that 11th loss, he decided to go out on a night run. Alone. On the night of October 3rd, Lawful would take off, fly over to the Japanese fleet group, bend it over into a dive, and dive bomb one of the targets shelling the airfield. That target ended up being the Japanese heavy cruiser IJN Furutaka, and not only did he hit it, He crippled it. He hit this thing so hard that a week later it would commit self-coral reef, earning Lawful the Navy Cross and the squadron probably a massive morale boost. The Ace of Spades would continue fighting from Henderson Field until November 2nd, when they would leave for home and return to Naval Air Station San Diego, California by November 19th. From then until early 1944, there's no other real action being heard from them, so I'm guessing they got a whole year of R&R and training with the exception of rebasing at Naval Air Station El Toro, California in January of 1943. But what we do know is their next recorded action is on February 4th, 1944, when they began taking part in the, quote, milk runs over the Marshall Islands.
That should be easy.
The name is a bit misleading, though, because the place of concern in the Marshall Islands was the island of Rabaul, and specifically Truk Atoll. This was a massively built-up and fortified Japanese base with a lot of enemy planes and a good few anti-aircraft guns, and Rear Admiral Mark A. Misters was determined to bomb that thing to the ground. Before the second raid on Truk, he was quoted as saying, "Plaster Truk with everything you have, including empty beer bottles if you have any." VMF-231 and the rest of the dive bombers of both 5th Fleet and Majuro Atoll would pound this fortress hard enough to make the Rear Admiral's wife jealous. But despite the efforts, the bastion would not fall until the surrender of Japan in August of 1945. VMF-231 would go through 2 more redesignations in that time frame, converting to the F-4U Corsairs and changing to Marine Bomber Fighter Squadron or VMBF-231 in not July of 1944, for once. This time it was October, and then they reverted back to VMSB-231 2 days before New Year's on the 30th of December 1944. And as an added bonus, the squadron would rack up 7 air-to-air kills during their time in the war. Once the war was over, though, VMSB-231 would become a Marine Corps Reserves detachment, once again designated VMF-231. They would operate out of Akron, Ohio and Grosse Isle Township, Michigan until being deactivated for the second time on August 31st, 1962. VMF-231 would be unshuffled a third time on May 15, 1973. This time as Marine Attack Squadron 231 or VMA-231. And this time they would be given the Marine Corps' newest card in the deck, which for once was a Marine exclusive, the AV-8A Harrier. The newest Harrier squadron wouldn't see combat immediately, but it would go achievement hunting for firsts. In June of 1978, they became the first Harrier squadron to operate from an LHA-class ship, that being LHA-2 USS Saipan, and then in October of 1973, they would make the first transatlantic flight by a Harrier unit so they could double tap and become the first US AV-8 unit to cross-train with RAF Harriers. Then on August 2nd, 1985, the Ace of Spades flew the AV-8A for the last time before turning over the next card, the AV-8B Harrier 2s. The improved Harriers were practically a different plane with all the improvements they've gotten, and they would need all of them. After deploying to the Western Pacific as a squadron for the first time since World War II in June of 1990, they set up shop in Iwakuni, Japan, near the very heart of the last country the squadron had actually fought.
My friend, it has been too long.
Great to see you again, buddy.
However, in December, their orders would get an extension, and VMA-231 would be redirected to Southeast Asia. Iraq had just invaded Kuwait, and the US was now moving forces to support Operation Desert Shield and protect Saudi Arabia against a potential second invasion. In response, the Ace of Spades squadron would draw upon the spirits of their ancestors and their ancient cans of old-fashioned ass-whoopings to make another absurdly long transoceanic journey to put somebody in the ground. VMA-231 would fly 18,000 nautical miles in 14 days, arriving in the first few days of January and racking up so many flight hours that, in the month of December alone, they would break the Fleet Harrier squadron record for highest number of flight hours in a month and racked up 904 flight hours. And when Desert Shield evolved into Desert Storm on January 17, 1991, they had their can openers lined up and ready to go. VMA-231 would be active every day of the conflict from the first day onward, and they were given a lot of different missions. Battlefield air interdiction, deep air support, close air support, helicopter escort, rescue combat air patrol, reconnaissance. They would do whatever they were asked to. And if they were asked to blow something up, it did not matter what it was, they'd blow it the f*** up. And you might think I'm exaggerating a bit when I say that, but no. Their list of enemy targets destroyed includes tanks, towed artillery, self-propelled artillery, armored personnel carriers, utility vehicles, rocket artillery batteries, tactical missile batteries, surface-to-air missile batteries, anti-aircraft guns, radar relay sites, command posts, ammo storages, revetments, which were basically aircraft hangars dug into holes in the ground, foxholes, which are just actual holes in the ground, trenches, which are slightly different holes in the ground, other fortified field positions, and a lot of the people in those field positions. Hell, these guys even blew up a few minefields, you know, just to get the point across.
You get a bullet, and you get a bullet. Everybody gets a bullet.
When the ground campaign began in February and air operations intensified, VMA-231 would again break the monthly Harrier squadron flight hour record, the same one they had just set 2 months ago, this time going up by 62 flight hours to 962.2 total. By the end of Desert Storm, Ace of Spades Squadron had racked up 1,195.8 flight hours over 987 sorties, dropping 1,660 Mark 82 500-pound bombs, 62 Mark 83 half-ton halos, 969 Mark 20 Rockeye cluster bombs, 78 Mark 77 incendiary bombs, and slung 22,709 20mm middle fingers for a grand total of nearly 1.7 million pounds of Tusken Raider to tumbleweed technology. After that, they were brought back stateside and sat around doing training, exercises, air shows, and other peacetime operations until April 1999, when they were attached to the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MEU, one of the 7 all-in-one quick response forces that the U.S. can deploy on the President's command to respond to combat, security, and disaster relief crises as needed. And it's one of the even smaller number of MEUs capable of hosting special forces operators. I'm trying to tell you that the 26th MEU is like a floating main character with enough standalone firepower to take over a small country.
Even the wrath of God is no match for the United...
The 26th MEU would then go on to participate in damn near every major operation the U.S. would engage in. These included the operations in and around Kosovo and much of the Balkans, like Operations Allied Force, Joint Garden, and Shining Hope, flying over Libya in 2011 for Odyssey Dawn, and humanitarian missions like Avid Response. They would deploy to Operation Iraqi Freedom not once, but twice. First in April 2003, then again in the spring of 2007, racking up 5,158 flight hours over 1,738 sorties. Then they would go out for a tour during Operation Enduring Freedom in November 2009 as part of MAG-14. And to cap it off, they would take part in anti-terrorism operations like Inherent Resolve. And very recently, starting in December 2023, they would aid in Operation Prosperity Guardian for airstrikes against the Houthis.
Grass grows, birds fly, sun shines, and brother, I hurt people.
This squadron would get a special Harrier 2 paint job designed after their origins on their 90th birthday in 2009. And as of February 8, 2019, the Ace of Spades Squadron is officially a centennial. It is more than 100 years old. Currently here in August of 2025, VMA-231 still flies the Aviate-B Harrier 2s, albeit the Plus models, and they are based out of Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, North Carolina, under the command of Marine Aircraft Group 14, or MAG-14, and the 2nd Marine Air Wing, or 2MA. However, the unit is slated to be deactivated a third time. As part of 2MA's plans to modernize their force, VMA-231 is going to be deactivated next month, September of 2025, after retiring their Harriers, and reactivated sometime in 2026 with one more new designation, Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 231, or VMFA-231. The reborn squadron will convert from the 2+ Harriers to the F-35B Lightning IIs, and for the first time in the squadron's whole 100+ year history, they will finally be able to pierce through the sound barrier. So let's sum up the accomplishments, achievements, and service record one more time from the top. First Permanent Marine Aviation Squadron, fought in the Banana Wars, first American pilots to use dive bombing in combat, first Marine pilots to conduct a combined air-ground combat action, 1v1ing a Japanese heavy cruiser at night and winning 2 movies, broke their monthly Harrier Squadron flight hours record twice, broke 2 longest flight records, one for single-engine aircraft in World War II and another for Harrier flights in the 1970s, first American Harrier Squadron to cross-train with the British, first Harrier Squadron to operate on an LHA-class ship, deactivations, 2, soon to be 3, activations, 3, soon to be 4, name changes, 11, soon to be 12, deployments, I lost count, awards, 2 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 1 Navy Cross, 1 V-Stall Squadron of the Year Award in 1977, 3 Marine Corps Aviation Association Squadron of the Year Awards in 1981, 1982, and 1984, 4 Chief of Naval Operations Safety Awards in 1991, 92, 95, and 96, 2 Marine Corps Attack Squadron of the Year Awards in 1992 and 2008, and in June 2012, Boeing would recognize the Ace of Spades Squadron for achieving 30,000 consecutive flight hours without a single mishap, a feat they would achieve over a decade of service and 3 combat tours while flying Harriers. And that's not even counting all the ones I couldn't find. So in summation, if you ever see that Ace of Spades on the side of a Marine Corps airplane, you show that thing some respect. Not only has it been around longer than you have, it's probably seen more of the world than even your grandpa did. Good and bad. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description below, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.